The Boy Who Drew Birds. It was true that John James could skate, hunt, and ride better than most boys. True also that he could dance the minuet and gavotte as if he had been born a king. He could fiddle, he could flirt, he could fence. But what he liked to do best, from sun up to sundown, was watch birds. John James's happiest moments were of woodland walks with his father near their home in France. On these walks, Papa Audubon would talk of birds, their beautiful colors, their graceful flight, and, most wonderful of all, their mysterious disappearance each fall, followed by their faithful return in the spring. But now John James was 18 years old, and he walked through the Pennsylvania woods alone, his father 4,000 miles away. Only 6 months before, his father had put him on a ship. The ship carried John James to America, where he was to live in a farmhouse on the banks of a creek. His father had sent him there to learn English, to learn commerce, to learn how to make money in America. But mostly, he had sent away his only son so that John James would not have to fight in Napoleon's war. John James wondered if he would ever see his father again. It was April in Pennsylvania, and slashes of snow still lay deep in the deep hollows. John James splashed across the icy creek. He scrambled up the bank and approached the limestone cave, wondering what he would find today. Just the empty nest of a pewee bird, as he had found in the last 5 days? Or would there be... Fiff, fiff, fiff! A flurry of wings greeted John James. The pewee flycatchers had returned. The female bird flew out of the cave like an arrow shot from a bow. The male bird, larger and darker, beat his wings above John James's head and snapped his beak. Clack, clack, clack! John James ran out of the cave and crouched next to the creek. He watched as the birds dipped and soared, snapping up mayflies in flight. Are these the same pewees who built the nest last year? He wondered. Where do they spend all winter? Will they return next spring? John James ran home through the woods. Madame Thomas! Madame Thomas! He shouted, bursting into the farmhouse kitchen. Il y a des oignons. In his excitement, his words tumbled out in French. Mrs. Thomas was the housekeeper Papa Audubon had hired to take care of Mill Grove, his American farmhouse. She pointed her long wooden spoon at John James's muddy shoes. He quickly took them off and placed them by the fire to dry. Birds, he said. I see birds, too. In cave, beautiful. Mrs. Thomas frowned. She was fond of this energetic French boy, and yet she had to admit that he was something of a cracked pot. Birds, always birds, from the moment he woke up in the morning to the moment he closed his eyes at night. He thought only of birds. It was strange for a boy his age. Master Audubon, she scowled, thou wouldst do well to do God's work by tending the farm more and chasing after birds less. But John James, halfway up the staircase, pretended not to hear. He climbed straight to his attic room, his musée he called it. Every shelf, every tabletop, every spare inch of floor was covered with nests and eggs and tree branches and pebbles and lichen and feathers and stuffed birds, redwings and crackles, kingfishers and woodpeckers. The walls were covered with pencil and crayon drawings of birds, all signed JJA. Every year on his birthday, John James took down these drawings, a year's worth of work, and burned them in the fireplace. He hoped someday he would make drawings worth keeping. John James went to his bookcase and took down the natural history books, gifts from his father. Where do small birds go in the winter? Do the same birds come back to the same nests each spring? The scientists who wrote these books did not agree. Each one gave a different answer. 2,000 years before, the Greek philosopher Aristotle had given his answers to these questions. Aristotle said that every fall great flocks of cranes flew south and returned in the spring, but he believed that small birds did not migrate. Small birds, wrote Aristotle, hibernated under water or in hollow logs all winter. Many scientists of the day still agreed with Aristotle. Small birds, they say, gathered themselves in a great ball, clinging beak to beak, wing to wing, and foot to foot, and lay under water all winter, frozen like. Fishermen even told stories of catching such tangles of birds in their nests. John James had never, ever found a tangled ball of birds under water, and he did not believe everything the scientists said. Why, some of them believed that birds transformed from one kind into another each winter, and one scientist claimed that birds traveled to the moon each fall and returned in the spring. He said the trip took 60 days. John James had never spent much time inside a classroom, and he had failed every exam he had taken in school. But he considered himself a naturalist. He studied birds in nature to learn their habits and behaviors. I will bring my books to the cave, John James decided, and my pencils and paper. I will even bring my flute. I will study my cave birds every day. I will draw them just as they are. And because he was a boy who loved the outdoors more than the inn, that's just what he did. In a week, the birds were used to him. They ignored him as if he were an old stump. They carried bits of moist mud as he drew with his pencils. They brought in tufts of green moss as he read his French fables. They gathered stray goose feathers from the banks of the creek as he played songs on his flute. Soon the dried brown nest had become a soft green bed, and John James had learned to imitate the throaty call of the birds. Fee-hee, fee-hee. Spring slipped into summer. Summer sighed and became fall. John James watched as 2 broods of nestlings hatched. He watched as the young birds flew for the first time. He began to feel a part of the small family. When the days grew shorter and the autumn air began to bite, John James knew the birds would soon leave. But would they come back? He had to know. The question was terribly important to the boy so far from his family. In bed that night, he formed a plan. The next day, when the mother and father birds were away from the nest, John James picked up one of the baby birds. He had read of medieval kings who tied bands on the legs of their prized falcons so that a lost falcon could be returned. Why not band a wild bird to find out where it goes? It had never been done, but John James could try. He pulled a string from his pocket and tied it loosely around the baby bird's leg. The bird pecked it off. The next day he tied another string to the bird's leg. Again, the bird pecked it off. Finally, John James walked 5 miles to the nearest village and bought some thread woven in fine strands of silver. This thread was soft and strong. He tied a piece of it loosely to one leg of each baby bird. A week later, the birds were gone. All winter, John James worked in his musée, painting the pencil sketches he had made in the cave. He hoped that on his next birthday, he would have 1 or 2 pictures worth saving from the fire. The creek was frozen now, and each time John James skated past the empty cave, he thought of the 2,000-year-old question, where do small birds go? And do they return to the same nests in the spring? The days grew longer. The ice on the creek cracked and melted. One morning, John James heard a bird call, "Fee-hee, fee-hee." He ran to the cave. He ducked his head and stepped inside. The female bird did not fly out of the cave like an arrow shot from a bow. The male bird did not beat his wings above John James's head and snap his beak. Instead, they ignored John James, as if he were an old stump. Watching the birds fly in and out of the cave, John James knew that his friends had returned. But where were last year's babies, now grown? Had they returned too? He began to search the woods and orchard nearby, listening for their call. Out in the meadow, inside a hay shed, he found two birds building a nest. One wore a silver thread around its leg. Up the creek under a bridge, he found two more nesting birds, and one wore a silver thread around its leg. John James wanted to shout, "Yes! The same birds return to the same nest, and their children nest nearby." But who would have heard him? "I will write my father," he decided. "I will tell him what I have learned in America, and when I am older, I will find a way to tell the whole world." He ran back to the house to gather his pencils, paper, and flute. As he ran, he called, "Fee-hee, fee-hee." About John James Audubon. Banding a bird, that is, tying a marker around the bird's leg to track its movement, was an innovative idea in Audubon's time. In fact, in 1804, John James became the first person in North America to band a bird. His simple experiment helped prove a complex theory. Many birds return to the same nest each year, and their offspring nest nearby. This behavior is called homing. The rest of the world learned of Audubon's experiment when he wrote about it in his book, Ornithological Biography. Later in the 20th century, scientists used bird banding to prove that small birds migrate. Not long after the story in this book ends, John James returned to France and his father's house. Perhaps he, like the birds, felt a pull towards home. But a year later, he sailed back to America, saying goodbye to Papa Audubon, his friend through life. It was the last time he saw his father. The young John James grew to be the greatest painter of birds of all time. He was the first to paint life-size images of birds and the first to show birds hunting, preening, fighting, and flying. His revolutionary paintings pleased two audiences: scientists, who were drawn to their accuracy, and ordinary people, who simply enjoyed the beauty of his birds.